Hi, this is Josh Bronson and a video literary analysis for Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Now, the foreword at the beginning of the book is written by Dr. John Ray, but it also kind of helps shape Nabokov's book for what the stage is going to be like for how Lolita will turn out to be. 50 years later, I have the 50th anniversary edition of the book. It doesn't change the fact that Nabokov uses concise and clear language to guide the reader to look past Humbert's so-called moral leprosy and to see his brutal honesty. The tone Nabokov uses when introducing the idea that though Humbert is insane, his insanity had a clear cause, lends a greater reality to Lolita than the setting, which solidified it in both time and place. It's set throughout a time span around the World Wars. Nabokov himself stated in 1956 that there was no moral to the story, although Dr. John Ray's statements in the foreword was trying to argue that there was a moral. I guess in this case I would take Nabokov's statements because he wrote the book, though it's interesting to get another perspective from a doctor. In part 1, the development of Humbert begins with his personal recollections from prison to his youth. The presence of Annabelle in his life provides strong pointers to how his experiences with Lolita occurred, including his need to recreate his childhood love, which I will get more on that later. Annabelle's untimely death most likely caused irreparable damage to Humbert's psyche and culminated in more than one psychotic breakdown due to his inability to have significant intimate relationships with those he describes as nymphs, which might be a factor of his fragile mental state, his insanity, that he believes that there are some women between the ages of 9 to 14 that are demonic. So, though this is an indicator that the narrator is potentially out of his mind, it provides background on the self-justification he is no doubt seeking in prison as he is writing under observation. However, because Humbert is writing while being watched, it is possible that he is writing anything he can to make his perversions seem more legitimate. In this case, I would imagine that anytime Humbert is making himself look better than what really happened, it's because he's in prison. And he, probably 2 or 3 times throughout the book, he states that he's being watched, or he knows that there are certain guards that are reading what he's writing, etc. Through the services of young prostitutes, his attempts to assuage his desire for younger women prove fruitless and cause him to seek more and more drastic measures to get what he wants. On one case, this turned out pretty bad for him. 2 such events were his excursion to a brothel in search of a legal companionship and the attempt to stay with a man known to have a young daughter. Now, when he went to the brothel, that's when he is pretty brutally confronted, and the girl ends up being not what he wants at all, older and heavier, etc., than the type of body he sees. Probably all of these women he's trying to find are just recreations of Annabelle for him in his mind. But the other occasion was when he found Mrs. Hayes. So she was technically, in that case, he was more successful, even though the man's house that he was supposed to stay with burned down. This freak accident resulted in his rooming with Mrs. Hayes, mother of Dolores Hayes, who is Lolita in the book. By some unnatural luck, he had met Lolita. In their first meeting, he applies the image of Annabelle to her, but eventually her presence and image nearly erases that of Annabelle to become the new fixation of both his childhood desires and adult perversions. A lot of the times when he tries to justify his being with younger women, it's him saying, just like Annabelle, or she looks like Annabelle, or this girl is his new Annabelle, etc. But once Lolita is in his life, he now has a new fixation. So he's saying, oh, I can hardly remember what Annabelle looks like anymore. I have Lolita instead. I think that part 1 especially shapes Humbert as a man with 2 sides. He's both psychotic and deranged, but he's also a broken man. I think his psychological aspects are totally shattered. Now, this comes from the death of Annabelle, his childhood and first love. It's doubtful that his reasons would hold up in court around the time of World War I. It's clear that his mental state is not random at all. In that time, I would say most people that were considered mentally damaged or crazy were the ones that would just get thrown in jail. There was no psychological help for these people. They would just, if you're crazy, you're crazy. You need to be away from society. And it's a lot different now. If you have a certain mental problem, they'll just put you in a ward or whatsoever, instead of being just thrown in jail and throw away the key. So I feel that the book outlines 2 main themes and issues, which is the psychological state of Humbert that decays as the book progresses, beginning with the major incident where Annabelle, his young childhood love, dies, and the morality of Lolita herself and the decisions that cause her to act the way she does. Beginning with Humbert, it is clear to me that his undeniable madness stems from the earlier loss. Annabelle's death is provided as early as page 13 at the end of chapter 3, where she dies from typhus. Two passages capture Humbert's mindset the clearest, the first being her death, where Nabokov writes, "Under the flimsiest of pretenses, this is our very last chance and nothing really mattered, we escaped from the cafe to the beach and found a desolate stretch of sand, and there, in the violet shadow of some red rocks forming a kind of cave, had a brief session of avid caresses with somebody's lost pair of sunglasses as the only witness." While Nabokov thankfully does not go into much detail, it is also made abundantly clear that Humbert both felt and forged a major connection with Annabelle that was brutally severed with her early death from typhus. So, throughout that whole summer, he had been trying to be with Annabelle, and finally he is, and then not long after that is her death. So the second useful passage that displays Humbert's fragile psyche is on the very next page. Page 15 is the last passage of chapter 4. It follows, "And the ache remained with me, and that little girl with her seaside limbs and ardent tongue haunted me ever since, until at last, 24 years later, I broke her spell by incarnating her into another." Humbert finally believes that he's free from the damage that Annabelle's death had done to him when he discovers Lolita, but in reality, he is only repeating it. In this way, Humbert never really breaks what he calls Annabelle's spell. He never again returns to normal attraction with others. Not only that, but I think that the beginning of Humbert's permanent mental breakdown, starts with Annabelle, and as he goes through life, he has a series of challenges that come from his pedophilia. So first Annabelle dies, and then he's obviously torn apart, mentally damaged. Now he thinks he needs to find somebody like Annabelle or some kind of way to get those feelings out of him to break her spell. But I would say that in his acts of trying to find prostitutes and things like that are young, in part 1 he actually does find a prostitute who's relatively young, and that provides like some kind of release for him, but she acts old, so he's also looking, I think, for innocence. Which speaks a lot about the end of the book when Lolita is pregnant and she's moving on with her life. I think that not only has she lost, the age of 9 to 14 like he prefers, but she's also lost the innocence that he's seeking as a pedophiliac. So Humbert finally shows the beginnings of his sanity both at the end of the book and due to the unusual flashback structure of his writing at the beginning. From the outset of Lolita, Humbert states that he is in prison and is being watched at all times, and that some may be reading his writing as he writes. While this could possibly be true due to his status and nature as a pedophile, it could also be garden variety paranoia resulting from his journey across the country that ended in murder and abandonment for his party of 2. Quite a brutal murder, which I will come to about Lolita's side of the story after my thoughts on part 2. So, my initial thoughts on Humbert remain constant throughout the book, almost in its entirety. Psychologically, he is obviously very deranged and damaged, resulting from the death of his first loved one as a young boy, resulting in the obsessive fixation on young women he deems nymphets. However, what did shock me was that Lolita herself allowed Humbert to basically get what he wanted, culminating in their trip across the country after the death of her mother. Now, I would say that she allowed him to get what he wanted as the start of that trip. Obviously, for a lot of the trip, he's blackmailing her. Throughout the middle of the end of the book, it seems that Humbert grows more and more desperate in his attempts to win her over, as is especially apparent when he drugs her in a hotel room. I believe that Humbert was growing far more attached to Lolita than he knew and intended. The sudden loss of her from his life clearly shows how poorly he had begun to handle being apart from her. Even the threat of blackmail by sending her to an orphanage was not beneath him. Now, the scene of him drugging her was pretty serious, but he did it very poorly. He didn't even drug her enough to knock her out. Only she was half lucid, never really all there during the incident overnight. So I would say that he's more desperate than cunning. I think that he's really losing, at that time he was losing his ability to think through his actions with Lolita. His eventual capture was not the true ending. However, it is far more interesting to hear about the later life of Lolita and how she married so early. Humbert's descriptions of her cast her in a light that make her seem like she should be undesirable to anyone but him. Despite this, she moves on with her life relatively quickly. Through the act of being with another man so soon, probably has roots within her beliefs that some of the things she has done with Humbert were not wrong. Now, I'll call it their final showdown, but in that argument between Humbert and Lolita where he demands a name and eventually pays her $4,000, he discovers that while she's with him, she doesn't really love him like she loves the other man. And I think that in some ways it's kind of wrong to say, oh, she was with Humbert and then now she's moving out of her life so fast she needs to be with men, etc. I think it's more like she's been trying to get away from Humbert, and this is her avenue out. So he is clearly more the aggressor than the victim in this strange relationship between him and Lolita. But her actions leave a lot of room to label her as someone who is both wittingly when young and possibly unwittingly when older, allowing Humbert to make his advances. As a young girl, she can't be expected to know any better about the role of Humbert as both stepfather and one who is interested in her as a lover, but she does not forestall his unusual shows of affection that were by no means normal. In one case, she actually prompts Humbert to lick her eyeballs, as shown on page 43 and 44. This quote, "Swiss peasant would use the tip of her tongue. Lick it out?" she questioned him. In many ways, I feel that Lolita's acts that encourage Humbert are more of a rebellion against her mother than acts that are meant to display her affection for him. So that could be a whole nother paper about the difference between her and Mrs. Hayes. At the end of the book, Lolita and Humbert are preparing to go their separate ways before Humbert murders Claire with several shots to the man's torso. He provides Lolita with $4,000 in both cash and check and remarks that he wishes Lolita had not cheated him, as she is now pregnant. I think those three acts, him paying Lolita, the murder of Claire, and Lolita being pregnant, are really the beginning of the end for it. Basically causes him to lose his mind, what's left of it, and end up in prison. So multiple flashbacks on pages 286 and 287 show the background of their mothers and point to another source that could be cause for the psychological damage on the pair. Lolita's mother, of course, was killed in what Humbert called a tragic accident, but as we know, he was planning it through the whole book, trying to get her killed. It was just, I'll say luck, but good fortune, I guess, for him that she dies without him being involved, really. On page 286 is when he refers back to it. But one that he was actually hoping for and planning, like I said. So Humbert's mother was struck by lightning when he was a younger child as an infant. So the loss of the two main figures in their lives may have been the cause for some of the unrest they experienced mentally and could also be blamed for the poor choices they make consistently. It's hard to tie reading Lolita in Tehran into this because of the nature of it's how young women react to reading the book. But I would think that, and there's evidence for that in the chapters, that Tehran will allow men to do essentially the same thing that Humbert did without penalty. They could be young as 9, while Humbert preferred them to be in the range of 9 to 14, so like Lolita was age 12. But it's also made clear that women in Tehran felt a connection with Lolita as victims that are trapped within their situation, much as Lolita did while being carted around the nation, and was only able to escape after Humbert began to lose it and committed a murder. In Tehran, there is no such easy way out because Humbert only fled across the country to avoid detection. Obviously, in Tehran, you'd have no issue if the type of relationship was discovered because it's legal. So I think that even though it's hard to form a tie, you can say that like Lolita is a victim of a lot of what Humbert is doing. There are women in Tehran who are victims of what the men there are doing. Though I think that the pedophilia of Humbert is psychological damage. It's hard to say that in Tehran because it's legal. So maybe the connection there is just between the women, and Humbert himself in America is seen as deranged, lunatic, pedophile, just because we have long-standing laws, traditions against what he's doing, and those don't exist in Tehran. All in all, I think that Lolita was an interesting book, but I don't think it's one I'd like to read again, just because, number one, uncomfortable topic as a mainstream American, unusual writing format, and also the whole book is written in a series of flashbacks, so it's a little bit hard to follow, but I do think that provides even more insight into Humbert's life now that he's in prison. Thank you.